My father raised his glass to the wealthiest people in town. "Every family has a disgrace," he announced. "And the Underwoods have me." My mother smiled. In her pristine gown, my sister let the room laugh before delivering a punchline that pinned every eye on me. I did not cry or run. I just looked down and texted one word. Release. That was the exact second the wedding died. Unearthing a truth buried for 15 years. My name is Phoebe Underwood. I am 34 years old, and I spend my nights dissecting the anatomy of greed. The stark white glow of 3 oversized monitors illuminated my corner office in downtown Atlanta. As the senior director of forensic review at Blackwater Advisory Group, a specialized financial investigation firm, my job is to find the ghosts hiding in corporate machines. When a sprawling family dynasty mysteriously bleeds cash, or a high-profile charity's ledger looks a little too pristine, they call me. I trace stolen money through labyrinthine offshore shells, phantom payrolls, and the kind of elegant internal fraud that hides comfortably behind black-tie charity galas and foundation dinners. I know how to stare at a 500-page balance sheet and spot a felony before the ink even dries on the fraudulent invoices. It was nearly midnight on a Tuesday, the city below reduced to a grid of silent orange streetlights, when my personal phone vibrated violently against my glass desk. The caller ID read Nora Beckett. I stared at the name, feeling a sudden, sharp drop in my stomach. Nora was the longtime administrator of the Underwoods Scholars Trust, the educational fund my grandfather established for underprivileged students back in the wealthy enclave of Briar Glen, South Carolina. She was also one of the very few people from my past who still possessed my private number. I had not spoken to her in 5 years. A call from Briar Glen at this hour never meant good news. I picked up the phone. "Nora, is someone dead?" "Phoebe," Nora whispered. Her voice trembled, thin and laced with a raw terror that made my forensic instincts immediately flare. "No one is dead, but I had to call you when I knew they were all asleep." "Are you alone?" "I am at the office. It is just me and the night security team on this floor. What is going on?" "You received the invitation to Delaney's wedding." "Right," Nora asked, her breath catching in her throat. "I did," I replied, leaning back in my ergonomic chair and staring at the ceiling. "And I tossed it directly into the shredder. I assumed it was a cheap public relations move. My mother probably wanted to tell her country club friends that she extended an olive branch to her estranged daughter, fully expecting me to reject it." "It is not just a public relations move," Nora said, her tone growing frantic. Phoebe, you need to listen to me. They are not inviting you because they miss you. They need you there, the groom's family, the Mercers. They are old money, very traditional, and highly focused on family unity. Your parents need you in the family portraits to prove to the in-laws that the Underwood house is perfectly intact, but that is just the surface. I narrowed my eyes at the glowing spreadsheets on my primary screen. What is underneath? Nora. They are planning to ambush you, she confessed, the words tumbling out in a panicked rush. I was organizing the catering schedules in your father's home office this afternoon, and I saw a printed draft of the reception speeches. It is a highly coordinated routine. Your father, your mother, and Delaney. They are going to frame it as a self-deprecating joke, but they are going to publicly name you the family disgrace. They want to lay all the blame for the past on you, right in front of the Mercers, to preemptively explain away why you are the broken child. They are going to humiliate you so thoroughly that no one in that room will ever believe a single word you say. I did not flinch. I did not cry. 15 years ago, that revelation would have shattered my entire world. Now, it merely felt like a missing piece of a complex financial puzzle locking firmly into place. That is incredibly cruel, even for them, I said, keeping my voice entirely flat and devoid of emotion. But Graham Underwood does not do anything just for the sake of cruelty. Cruelty is a byproduct. Money is always the motive. What else did you find? Nora let out a ragged, exhausted sigh. You always were the smartest person in that house. It is the trust. Phoebe, the scholarship fund, The books are completely off. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. Define off? I am seeing invoices for community outreach that do not match any events we ever held, Nora explained. We are talking about tens of thousands of dollars bleeding out every single quarter. And worse, much worse, I found a stack of board meeting minutes from the last 8 months. Your name is on them. I have not set foot in Briar Glen in 15 years, I said, my grip tightening on the phone until my knuckles turned white. I was removed from everything. Not legally, Nora corrected quickly. Your grandfather made sure you were a permanent co-signer. They never officially removed you because doing so would trigger a mandatory independent audit. But the new, forged minutes claim you were present via proxy, and they state that you have voluntarily withdrawn from all oversight rights. They are going to corner you at the end of the wedding weekend and force you to sign a physical confirmation of that withdrawal. If you sign it, you legitimize all the fake minutes. My mind raced, categorizing the variables, building the timeline, the Mercer family. Cynthia Mercer ran the Mercer Civic Trust. They were about to inject a massive grant, likely several $million, into the coastal scholarship programs. They are laundering the trust's history, I muttered, the strategy becoming crystal clear. They are using the wedding as a smokescreen. They get me in a room, isolate me, leverage the immense social pressure of a high society wedding, and force me to sign away my rights. Once I sign, they have a clean legal slate before the Mercer grant hits the accounts. And the toast, the public humiliation, that is their insurance policy. If I ever try to blow the whistle afterward, I am already branded a jealous, unstable disgrace in front of the very people who hold the purse strings. Phoebe, it gets worse, Nora whispered, her voice cracking. If you do not sign, your father threatened to freeze the spring tuition disbursements. Real students will lose their scholarships. A cold, familiar rage coiled deep in my chest. 15 years ago, they framed me for their own greed. They kicked me out, destroyed my reputation in my hometown, and stole my grandfather's legacy. I rebuilt myself from absolute nothing. I became the very thing they should fear most, an apex predator of financial fraud. I am not going, I said, my voice hardening into solid ice. Let them forge my signature. Let them have their vile little party. I have a life here. I am not stepping back into that slaughterhouse. You have to, Nora pleaded. Give me one good reason why I should subject myself to a room full of people who want nothing more than to watch me bleed. Nora went completely silent for 5 long seconds. When she finally spoke again, her voice held no fear, only a devastating, inescapable clarity. If you do not come back, they will tell your story their way for another 15 years. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone to the desk. The vast silence of the office pressed in on me. I looked at the forensic accounting software on my monitor. I spent my days hunting arrogant criminals who thought they were untouchable because they wore expensive suits and smiled for the cameras. My father was no different. My mother was no different. My sister was no different. They thought I was still the terrified 19-year-old girl they threw away like garbage. They thought I was permanently broken. They did not realize that the fire they used to burn me down had forged something entirely different. I did not care about familial love anymore. I cared about the evidence. I cared about my honor. And my gut told me the scholarship fund that had ruined my life was now being used as a personal ATM disguised by false philanthropy. I opened a new browser tab and navigated to an airline website. I typed in the airport code for Charleston, the closest major hub to Briar Glen. I booked a first-class ticket for Thursday morning, exactly 48 hours before the rehearsal dinner. Next, I opened my corporate calendar and blocked out the entire week, labeling it as a zero-contact emergency field investigation. It was not a lie. This was going to be the most vicious fraud case of my professional life. Finally, I picked up my phone and opened my heavily encrypted messaging app. I selected the contact for Mara Keene. Mara was not just my best friend. She was a brilliant digital data preservation expert. If I was going to war against my own blood, I needed my quartermaster. My fingers flew across the digital keyboard. I did not explain the wedding trap. I did not explain the trust fund anomaly. I just typed one sentence, knowing she would understand the gravity of it immediately. I think they went too far this time. I hit send, the screen flashing as the message locked into the secure server. I stood up, turned off my office lights, and walked out into the Atlanta night. The Underwood family wanted a disgrace for their wedding. I was going to give them an executioner. I was 19 years old when I learned that in wealthy families, loyalty is not something you earn. It is a commodity you purchase, and if you refuse to be bought, you are simply erased. My grandfather, Elias Underwood, was the only person in Briar Glen who believed my meticulous nature was a gift rather than a social defect. Before his heart finally gave out, he legally placed my name alongside my father's as a symbolic co-supervisor of the Underwood Scholars Trust. He thought he was handing me a shield to protect me from the vicious vanity of my own bloodline. He did not realize he was handing them the perfect weapon for my character assassination. The catalyst arrived during a suffocating, deeply humid, mid-July summer. I had volunteered to help organize the physical accounting ledgers in the estate's East Wing library. The room smelled of old binding glue, lemon wood polish, and stale air conditioning. I sat at a massive mahogany table, systematically cross-referencing bank statements against the printed receipts for community outreach programs. I was a diligent student. I liked when columns balanced. It took me less than 2 hours to realize that the math in my grandfather's sacred trust was bleeding out. I found an invoice for $12,000 categorized under a spring charity gala. I knew for a fact that the gala had been canceled due to rain. I traced the vendor identification number attached to the payment. The money had not gone to a catering company. It had paid for custom-imported Italian silk drapery and antique lighting fixtures for my mother's newly renovated sitting room. I dug deeper, my stomach twisting into a tight, cold knot. I found another wire transfer for $45,000 directed to a boutique event planning agency. A brief search through the state business registry revealed that the registered owner of that agency was a silent partner in my father's commercial real estate firm. There were phantom caterers, ghost scholarship drives, and thousands upon thousands of dollars funneling into a meticulously designed labyrinth of shell accounts. I did not panic. I was young, and I assumed it was a horrific, monumental administrative error. I gathered the heavy blue binders, walked down the grand carpeted hallway, and knocked firmly on the heavy oak door of my father's study. Graham Underwood sat behind his desk, the evening light catching the ice in his glass of expensive bourbon. When I laid the discrepancies out in front of him, pointing to the mismatched dates and the shell company names, he did not look surprised. He did not look angry. He looked entirely bored. "It is a complex financial ecosystem. Phoebe," he said, taking a slow, measured sip of his drink. "Money moves where it needs to move to keep the entire machine running. You are looking at a localized pond, but I manage the whole ocean. Do not make a fuss over things you do not comprehend." He opened his top right drawer and pulled out a single sheet of premium cardstock paper. It was a formal board resolution, cleanly typed and waiting for ink. It explicitly stated that I had reviewed all summer expenditures, verified the community outreach costs, and validated them as approved and necessary. I looked at the top right corner. The date was backdated by 3 full weeks. He held out a gold fountain pen. "Sign it," he commanded, his voice dropping the paternal warmth and adopting the tone of a CEO giving an order to a junior clerk. "We will adjust the tax columns next fiscal year. Be a good girl. Stop acting like a dramatic child, and sign the paper." I stared at the gold pen resting on the dark wood. I thought I was simply refusing to participate in a minor felony. I told him no. I told him I would not put my signature on stolen money meant for teenagers who could barely afford their winter coats. I turned around and walked out of the room. I was naive enough to believe that the truth possessed its own natural armor. I did not understand that by refusing him, I was not just pointing out an accounting error. I was declaring outright war on the entire architecture of the Underwood power structure. The retaliation did not take months to materialize. It took exactly 6 days. It started as a subtle, toxic shift in the atmosphere of our home. The household staff suddenly stopped making eye contact with me. My mother, Elise, began sighing loudly whenever I entered a room. She spent her afternoons on the telephone, complaining loudly to her country club friends about how difficult, paranoid, and emotionally erratic her eldest daughter had become. Then, the digital locks changed. My access codes to the Trust's online archives were revoked by day 4. My parents sat me down in the formal living room. They did not shout. They used the quiet, deeply concerned tones of people speaking to a dangerous psychiatric patient. My father informed me that he had discovered unauthorized data transfers on the family network, implying I was trying to steal proprietary information. My mother wept softly, pressing a lace handkerchief to her eyes, asking the empty air why I was so consumed by jealousy and resentment toward my own flesh and blood. They told me I was mentally unstable. They told me my grandfather had made a terrible, senile mistake by trusting a teenager with serious administrative duties. My sister, Delaney, was only 17 years old at the time. She sat perched on the edge of the velvet sofa, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Delaney was young, but she already possessed an apex predator's instinct for social survival. She knew exactly which way the wind was blowing, and she knew who signed her credit card bills. When the Whisper campaign inevitably seeped out of our house and into the manicured lawns and garden parties of Briar Glen, Delaney did not actively participate in the slander. But she did the one thing that was infinitely more damaging. She stayed completely silent. When the daughters of my parents' wealthy friends cornered Delaney by the country club pool and asked if it was true that Phoebe had been caught messing around with the poor kid's scholarship money, Delaney just looked down at her sandals, bit her lower lip, and offered a sad, helpless nod. Her calculated silence was the final, devastating seal of authenticity on my guilt. The public execution took place on the second Saturday of October, during the annual Autumn Harvest fundraiser. I attended the event because I stubbornly believed my physical presence would prove I had absolutely nothing to hide. I wore a simple, conservative black dress and stood near the silent auction tables, trying to project quiet dignity. I felt the stares immediately. They felt like physical weights pressing into my skin. The polite chatter would abruptly stop the moment I walked past a group, instantly replaced by cold, hard glares and shielded whispers. In a claustrophobic town like Briar Glen, perception was absolute reality. Halfway through the evening, the string quartet stopped playing. My father approached the center stage microphone to give his keynote address. I stood in the back near the exit doors, waiting for him to announce the year's new scholarship recipients. Instead, I felt a heavy, unyielding hand grip my left elbow. I turned my head to see 2 private security contractors in dark suits. "Miss Underwood," the taller one said softly, his grip tightening, "your father has requested that we escort you off the premises immediately. Please do not make a scene." I froze, the air leaving my lungs. I looked up at the brightly lit stage. My father was looking directly at me over the heads of 200 wealthy donors. He leaned intimately into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Graham said, his voice dripping with a masterfully practiced, paternal sorrow, "I must ask for your grace and your prayers tonight. As many of you know, my eldest daughter is currently going through a very dark and troubled period. She is facing some severe internal issues, and we are handling it as a private family matter. We appreciate your understanding." The entire ballroom shifted in unison. 200 pairs of eyes turned toward the back doors, stripping away my dignity, my personal history, and my humanity. In that singular moment, I was no longer the smart, capable girl who helped her grandfather read to elementary school children. I was a thief. I was a liar. I was a sick, jealous creature who tried to steal from a charity. And I had absolutely zero proof to say otherwise. I had no printed ledgers. I had no server access. I had no allies. The security guards practically carried me out through the grand double doors. The heavy wood clicked shut behind me with a sickening thud, severing me from my family, my reputation, and my hometown forever. I drove back to the empty estate, walked into my bedroom, and packed exactly one suitcase. I threw it into the trunk of my beat-up sedan. I did not leave a note on the kitchen counter. I did not say goodbye to Delaney, who I saw watching me from her second-story bedroom window, half hidden behind the sheer curtains like a ghost. I gripped the steering wheel so hard, my hands ached as I drove past the Briar Glen city limits sign. I did not shed a single tear. The sheer scale of the injustice was too massive for crying. It required something much colder. Something permanent. I made a silent vow to the empty stretch of midnight highway. I promised myself that I would never, ever be helpless again. I promised that if I ever returned to this suffocating town, I would not come back seeking tearful apologies or familial love. I would come back armed with the one thing my family feared more than the devil himself. I would return with timestamps, unbroken chains of evidence, and a trail of paper so undeniable it would bury them alive. The narrative in Briar Glen painted my departure as a tragic disappearance, a shameful exile of a girl who could not handle the pressure of her own lies. They told their country club friends that I had vanished into obscurity, probably working some menial job, too embarrassed to ever show my face in polite society again. That was the story they needed to believe to sleep soundly in their custom silk sheets. The reality was far less poetic and infinitely more dangerous. I did not disappear. I simply went to work. I spent my early 20s surviving on cheap black coffee and 4 hours of sleep a night. I took night classes at a state university while working full-time during the day as a junior data entry clerk for a mid-sized logistics firm. I paid for my accounting degree in cash, dollar by dollar, completely severing any financial umbilical cord to the Underwood estate. Once I secured my certified public accountant license, I did not stop. The memory of my father sliding that backdated resolution across his heavy mahogany desk was a permanent brand on my psyche. It pushed me to acquire my certified fraud examiner credentials. I realized very early on that standard accounting was about making sure the numbers added up. Forensic accounting was about discovering why someone was trying so desperately to make sure the numbers looked like they added up when they actually did not. I built my entire career brick by brick, not through flashy networking or leveraging a family name, but through ruthless, surgical precision. I learned how to hunt the specific type of greed that hides behind philanthropic galas and glossy charity brochures. Over the span of a decade, I transitioned from investigating minor corporate embezzlement to dismantling sophisticated, multi-tiered fraud networks. I became the person you called when a philanthropic family foundation was secretly operating as a private slush fund. I tore down fake wildlife sanctuaries that were actually funneling donor money into offshore real estate. I dismantled fake community outreach programs that existed purely to pay the board of directors exorbitant consulting fees. By the time I was recruited by Blackwater Advisory Group, I had a massive reputation in the industry. I was not known as a socialite or a disgraced heiress. I was known as the operative who could look at a perfectly balanced, audited financial statement and instantly smell the rot beneath the ink. At Blackwater, I handled the absolute worst offenders. I stripped away my first name on all non-essential company letterheads and client communications. To the outside corporate world, I was simply P. Underwood. The initial was a shield. It kept the clients focused on my results rather than my gender or my background. It also ensured that my family, who only tracked the high society circles of the southeastern seaboard, would never stumble across my professional footprint in the elite financial investigation sector. 3 months ago, a massive, highly confidential project landed on my desk. Blackwater had been retained by a major philanthropic entity to conduct a deep dive, pre-merger due diligence review. The client was the Mercer Civic Trust. They were preparing to finalize an 8-figure grant, a massive expansion package aimed at revitalizing educational opportunities along the coastal regions of the state. It was a legacy-defining philanthropic move. But before they released a single cent, their board of directors wanted Blackwater to quietly audit the primary beneficiary of this proposed expansion to ensure absolute structural integrity and transparency. The primary beneficiary they wanted me to investigate was the Underwoods Scholars Trust, the head of the Mercer Civic Trust, the woman aggressively pushing for this meticulous external review, was Cynthia Mercer. She was the mother of Nolan Mercer. She was the mother of the man who was about to marry my sister, Delaney. For the past 90 days, I had been in direct, encrypted email contact with Cynthia. We had exchanged dozens of messages regarding compliance standards, risk assessment protocols, and the specific forensic parameters she wanted my team to apply to the target fund. Cynthia Mercer was sharp, demanding, and utterly uncompromising when it came to financial hygiene. She had absolutely no idea that the senior director she was relying on to vet her future in-laws was the very same woman those in-laws had banished a decade and a half prior. We had never spoken on the phone. We had never met face to face. To Cynthia, I was just Underwood, the faceless expert at Blackwater, ensuring her family's money was safe. The sheer voltage of the paradox was almost blinding. My parents were throwing a lavish, theatrical wedding to cement a social and financial alliance with the Mercer family. They were planning to use that very wedding to publicly humiliate me, to preemptively frame me as a jealous pariah, all to protect their control over the scholarship fund. They were doing all of this to ensure the Mercer grant flowed smoothly into their accounts. Yet, the person holding the invisible scalpel, the only person who had the professional authority to sign off on the legitimacy of that grant, was the exact daughter they were trying to shove under the floorboards. I could have destroyed them 3 months ago. The moment I saw the Underwood Trust in the Blackwater crosshairs, I could have leaked the preliminary risk assessments. I could have anonymously tipped off Cynthia Mercer about the historic anomalies. I had the power to detonate their entire social empire from the safety of my Atlanta office. But I held back. I kept the files compartmentalized. I maintained absolute professional objectivity. That restraint was the fundamental difference between my father and me. Graham Underwood used information as a blunt weapon the second it suited his personal agenda. I treated information as a legally binding asset. I did not want to blow up a wedding out of petty revenge. I wanted to execute a flawless, legally unassailable financial extraction. But Nora's late-night phone call changed the operational parameters. My family was not just resting on their past sins. They were actively moving to forge my signature, steal more money, and use a sacred ceremony to permanently annihilate my character in front of the only people who could hold them accountable. I realized that if I was backed into a corner this weekend, I was not the helpless, isolated teenager they remembered. I held the keys to their entire future, and they were completely oblivious. The morning after I booked my flight, I walked into the glass-walled server room on the secure floor of Blackwater to meet with Mara Keene. Mara was our lead digital preservation architect. She possessed a brilliant, cynical mind and a profound disrespect for authority figures who abused their power. She was also the only person in the world who knew the entire unedited truth about my departure from Briar Glen. I handed her a physical, printed brief containing the flight itineraries, the wedding schedule, and the encrypted data logs Nora had managed to verbally describe over the phone. Mara did not read it immediately. She leaned against the humming server racks, her dark eyes scanning my face with absolute focus. She did not offer me a hug. She did not offer empty platitudes about family trauma or healing. She knew me far too well for that. "They are trapping you," Mara stated, her voice flat and analytical. "They are going to lock you in a room with a notary and a forged document, and they are going to use the psychological weight of 200 wealthy guests to crush your resistance." "That is the preliminary assessment," I agreed, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "They need my official, documented abdication before the Mercer money clears the final compliance checks." Mara tapped the manila folder against her leg. She looked down at the documents, then back up at me. "I can build you a digital dead man's switch. I can set up a secure cloud repository with auto-forwarding protocols linked to the State Attorney General and the IRS Fraud Division. We can give you an impenetrable defensive shield. But I need to know your exact objective here. Phoebe, do you want to survive this weekend, or do you want to end this story completely?" I looked at the blinking blue lights of the server racks, thinking about the stolen tuition money, the ghost invoices, and the fake smiles my parents would wear while they toasted to family values. I thought about the 15 years I spent proving to myself that I was not a criminal. I looked Mara directly in the eyes. Both. I drove into Briar Glen on Wednesday afternoon, 72 hours before the ceremony. The town looked exactly as I remembered it, suffocating beneath a thick canopy of old oak trees and forced southern charm. I bypassed the heavily gated entrance of the Underwood estate entirely and checked into the only boutique hotel on the main square. It was a minor logistical choice, but in a family that operated purely on optics, it was an immediate declaration of war. Within 20 minutes of my arrival, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother, Elise. She called my hotel reservation an unnecessary public insult, suggesting I was actively trying to embarrass them before the Mercer family even arrived. I turned my phone on silent and unpacked my laptop. The mandatory family dinner took place the following evening at 8 o'clock. Walking through the grand double doors of my childhood home felt like stepping into a perfectly preserved museum dedicated to my own erasure. The air smelled of expensive lilies and floor wax. Graham Underwood was waiting in the foyer. He did not offer a hug. He did not ask about my flight or my life in Atlanta. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at me as if I were a junior employee who had just arrived late for a performance review. "We need to go over the ground rules for the weekend," my father said, his voice dropping into that familiar, commanding cadence. "You will be seated at table 19, near the rear exit of the reception hall. You are not to initiate any private conversations with Cynthia or Nolan Mercer. If someone asks you a direct question, you will keep your answers brief, and you will absolutely not bring up anything regarding the past. Do we have a clear understanding?" "Crystal clear," I replied, maintaining unbroken eye contact. "I sit in the back. I stay silent. I act like a ghost." "You act like an Underwood," he corrected sharply, turning on his heel to lead me into the formal dining room. The dinner itself was a masterclass in psychological warfare masquerading as etiquette. The silver cutlery clinked softly against porcelain plates, but the silence was heavy and hostile. After the main course, my mother stood up and retrieved a large garment bag from the hall closet. She laid it across the back of an empty chair and unzipped it with a practiced, maternal smile. Inside hung a pale, shapeless, slate-gray dress that looked more like a uniform than a piece of celebratory attire. "I picked this out for you," Elise said, smoothing the lifeless fabric with her manicured hand. "It is understated. Given the circumstances, this will help you avoid drawing any unwanted attention. We want all the focus to remain firmly on your sister." It was a beautifully constructed insult. She was politely telling me that my very existence was a stain on the aesthetics of the weekend, and she wanted me visually erased from the background. "Thank you, Mother," I said, leaving the garment bag untouched. "I brought my own wardrobe, but I appreciate the thought." Her smile hardened into a thin line, but she did not argue. She simply nodded and signaled the hired staff to clear the plates. Delaney played her role flawlessly. When it was time for me to leave, the blushing bride intercepted me by the front staircase. She threw her arms around my shoulders in a tight, dramatic embrace, entirely for the benefit of our parents watching from the parlor. But as she leaned in, her cheek pressing against mine, the sweet facade instantly dissolved. Her voice dropped to an icy whisper directly into my ear. "Just try not to be yourself tomorrow night," Delaney murmured. "Do not ruin this for me." She pulled back, flashing a radiant, camera-ready smile, and glided back into the parlor. I turned toward the front door, feeling the familiar, suffocating weight of this house pressing down on my chest. But before I could reach the exit, my father called my name from the doorway of his home office. "A moment of your time before you head back to the hotel," Graham said, gesturing for me to enter his sanctuary. I stepped over the threshold. The room still smelled of bourbon and expensive leather. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder, tossing it casually onto the polished wood. "Since you are already here, we need to clear up some routine administrative paperwork," he said, waving his hand dismissively. The trust requires an updated file. It is just standard compliance regarding your inactive status. A formality, I picked up the top sheet. It was exactly what Nora had warned me about. The document was carefully drafted in dense legalese, but the core function was unmistakable. By signing, I would be legally confirming that I had voluntarily surrendered all my oversight rights years ago, retroactively validating every single forged board resolution they had created in my absence. I set the paper back down on the desk. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse him of fraud. I just offered him a cool, empty smile. "It looks a bit dense for a Thursday night," I said smoothly. "I will have my legal counsel review these documents first thing on Monday morning, and we can discuss the signatures then." The temperature in the room plummeted. Graham's relaxed posture vanished. His jaw tightened, and his eyes locked onto mine with a cold, predatory fury. He realized in that exact second that I was not the terrified teenager he had exiled. I was pushing back, and I was doing it in a language he understood perfectly: litigation. "You do not need a lawyer for a family trust update," he stated, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "I use a lawyer for everything," I replied, turning toward the door. "Good night, Father." As I walked out of the office, my gaze briefly swept across the small, antique side table near the bookshelf. A partially opened payment envelope rested next to a stack of mail. The thick, embossed logo on the corner of the invoice caught the ambient light. It was a crest of intertwined oak leaves, belonging to a company called Apex Event Solutions. My breath caught in my throat, though I kept my pace steady until I reached my car. I knew that logo. I knew that company name. It was the exact same shell corporation that had received the phantom community outreach funds from the scholarship ledger 15 years ago. I sat in the driver's seat of my rental car, staring through the windshield at the dark, imposing facade of the Underwood estate. The pieces snapped together with horrifying clarity. This wedding was not just a social event. It was not just a stage to humiliate me. The entire lavish affair, the caterers, the imported flowers, the lighting, it was all being bankrolled by stolen money. They were using the scholarship fund to pay for the very event they planned to use to destroy me. I did not sleep that night. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I sat in the cramped kitchen of Nora Beckett's small suburban house. The curtains were drawn tight. Spread across her laminate dining table were the smuggled, unredacted bank statements from the Underwoods Scholars Trust. Nora poured me a mug of black coffee, her hands shaking slightly as she set it down. "I printed everything I could access before the system locked me out for the night," she whispered. I leaned over the papers, tracing the routing numbers with the tip of my pen. It was a massacre of philanthropic integrity. I found a wire transfer for $65,000 explicitly categorized as an educational grant, which had routed directly into the accounts of the boutique florist handling Delaney's reception. I found another transfer for $40,000 labeled as structural repairs for the town library, which perfectly matched the invoice for the custom stage lighting and VIP guest gifts. Then, I found the killing blow. Buried at the bottom of the stack was an authorized draft for $200,000. The internal memo simply read, "Housing Stipend Initiative," but the receiving account did not belong to a student housing board. It belonged to a holding company registered under my sister's name. It was a massive, untraceable down payment for a luxury apartment in Charleston. I stared at the numbers until they burned into my retinas. My family was not just vain. They were operating a highly structured, systemic embezzlement ring. They were bleeding the future of this town dry to buy themselves a sparkling, flawless image. "You have them," Nora said softly, looking at the same damning line item. "You actually have the proof." I closed the folder, the heavy thud echoing in the quiet kitchen. I thought about my mother's shapeless dress, my father's list of rules, and my sister's cruel whisper. They wanted me to sit quietly at table 19 while they toasted to their own brilliance with stolen champagne. "Yes," I replied, staring at the closed folder. "I have them. Now, we build the trap." I knew exactly how my father operated. He relied on blinding speed and the absolute, unquestioning compliance of his local ecosystem. If I marched into the Briar Glen Police Precinct with my evidence, the chief of police, a man who played 18 holes of golf with Graham every single Sunday, would make a courtesy call to the estate before I even finished filling out the initial incident report. If I confronted my father directly with Nora's stolen financial documents on Friday morning, he would not break down and confess. He would simply trigger a catastrophic, system-wide data purge. He would wipe the trust servers, incinerate the physical ledgers in his backyard fire pit, and instantly pivot the public narrative to protect himself. By noon, Graham would be calling his contacts at the local newspaper, painting a tragic, tearful picture of his estranged, mentally unstable daughter who broke into his private office to ruin her sister's perfect weekend out of sheer, unadulterated jealousy. It was the exact same playbook he used against me when I was 19 years old, and in a closed-loop society like Briar Glen, that script always worked flawlessly. I needed a strategy that entirely bypassed his ability to spin the truth. I needed a trap he could not talk his way out of. That was exactly where Mara Keene came in. Mara arrived at my quaint, floral wallpapered boutique hotel just after 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon. She looked entirely out of place in this stifling southern town, wearing dark clothing and dragging 2 massive, reinforced transit cases filled with high-end, matte black hardware. Before Mara transitioned into the clinical, highly classified world of forensic data preservation, she had spent 6 long years working as a lead technical producer for large-scale corporate events and massive live broadcasts. She knew her way around lighting matrices, soundboards, and visual projection arrays better than anyone I had ever met in the corporate sector. We had spent the previous 48 hours constructing a ruthless, 2-tier operational protocol. Tier 1 was absolute, impenetrable data preservation. Tier 2 was synchronized, undeniable public exposure, engineered to detonate at the precise moment my family revealed their true nature to the crowd. Mara had already smoothly integrated herself into the wedding's chaotic vendor list. Using a shell email address and a fabricated portfolio, she had offered her services as a freelance audio-visual technician to the local production company handling the venue. They were understaffed and thrilled to have a seasoned expert on site. That clever maneuver gave her legitimate, unquestioned, and invisible access to the central control booth overlooking the entire reception hall at Alder Hall. While Mara configured her localized routing switches on the small hotel desk, I sat cross-legged on the bed and distilled 15 years of systemic embezzlement into a lethally concentrated digital weapon. I did not write a lengthy emotional manifesto detailing my innocence or my family's cruelty. I did not draft a complicated financial treatise that a layperson would struggle to comprehend after 2 glasses of expensive champagne. Instead, I built a presentation that was brutally short, razor-sharp, and entirely devoid of human emotion. I gathered the bank statements Nora had smuggled out of the study. I extracted the hidden metadata from the trust servers, highlighting the exact hour and minute the fraudulent board minutes were created. I structured my counterattack into a package of 4 undeniable slides. The first slide was a side-by-side comparison of the network data, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that my electronic signature had been grafted onto backdated documents just 3 weeks ago. The second slide traced the exact routing numbers of the scholarship funds, showing the money leaving the charity account and landing directly in the operating budget of the luxury wedding planner. The third slide was the authorized draft for a student housing stipend that perfectly matched the exact down payment for the corporate holding company registered under Delaney's name. The final slide was just a grand total, a sum reaching into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, money stolen directly from the town's most vulnerable children. I reduced a massive, highly complex fraud case into 4 stark images. No defensive adjectives, no bitter accusations, just the raw, undeniable mathematical anatomy of a felony. "The routing script is officially locked," Mara announced, turning her laptop screen toward me. Lines of command code scrolled rapidly across the dark background, reflecting in her dark eyes. "We are bypassing their localized server network entirely. I have set up an automated, highly encrypted relay protocol. All you have to do is open our secure messaging thread and send the word release. Do not capitalize anything. Do not add punctuation. Just type the word and hit send. Walk me through the exact sequence, I said, reviewing the final export of my slides to ensure the resolution was perfect. The millisecond your text hits the server, the system executes a simultaneous multi-point distribution, Mara explained, her voice steady, clinical, and professional. An encrypted file containing your entire evidence packet, heavily stamped with verified timecodes, will instantly transmit to 5 specific inboxes. Cynthia Mercer gets a copy. The senior legal counsel for the Mercer Civic Trust gets a copy. The 2 independent, non-family members of your father's own board of directors get copies. And the final, master copy drops into an untouchable offshore cloud vault that Graham could not access if he had the entire federal government working for him. And the secondary trigger, I asked, looking up from my screen. Mara offered a tight, dangerous smile. That is the fun part. The text message also triggers a remote override I installed on the venue's visual matrix. Whatever slideshow, video montage, or romantic lighting loop they are playing on the main projector screen will be instantly severed. The system will forcibly switch the input source to my hidden terminal in the booth, and your 4 slides will broadcast directly onto the main stage in pristine high definition, but you hold the detonator. Phoebe, if you do not send the word, the code stays completely dormant. Nothing sends to the lawyers. Nothing broadcasts to the room. I looked at the dark screen of my phone resting on the white bedsheets. The power to annihilate my family's entire social and financial empire was sitting right there, waiting for a single, effortless keystroke. Yet, despite the cold, 15-year-old fury burning deep in my chest, I felt a sudden, profound stillness wash over me. I thought about the little girl who used to sit in the library and idolize her father's intelligence. I thought about the younger sister who used to sneak into my bedroom to borrow my favorite sweaters. I did not want to destroy them just for the visceral thrill of destruction. I wanted to give them one final, absolute choice. I am not going to shoot first, I said softly, meeting Mara's gaze. I am going to put on that shapeless, insulting gray dress my mother bought me. I am going to walk into that reception hall, and I'm going to sit quietly at table 19 in the back corner near the kitchen doors. If they just let me be a ghost, if they conduct their beautiful wedding and leave my name out of their mouths, we walk away. We take the evidence straight to the state authorities on Monday morning and let the justice system dismantle their operation quietly, without the public spectacle. I will not hijack their screen unless they cross a line they cannot uncross. Mara stopped typing. She rested her hands on the keyboard and looked at me for a very long time. The hotel room was completely silent, save for the low mechanical hum of the air conditioning unit in the window. You are still giving them one last chance to be decent human beings, Mara finally said, her tone a complex mixture of professional respect and deep, cynical skepticism. Fine, we play it your way. But if they choose cruelty tonight, if they try to publicly butcher you for the amusement of their wealthy friends, you need to be ready to pull the trigger. Because if you send that word, this time the truth is going to travel faster than the lie. It will, I promised, my voice hardening into solid steel. I closed my laptop, the sharp mechanical click echoing loudly in the quiet room. The trap was perfectly set, the wires were hidden, and the explosive was primed. All that remained was to see if my family was truly arrogant enough to step directly into it. Alder Hall was a fortress of old Southern money, an opulent estate constructed in the early 20th century by a timber baron who wanted his legacy carved in stone and imported marble. The venue sat at the end of a winding private road flanked by ancient oak trees draped in heavy Spanish moss. Every square inch of the property was meticulously curated to send a single, unyielding message to anyone who walked through its massive wrought iron gates. The Underwood family belonged to a social echelon that never had to explain itself, and more importantly, never had to apologize. I did not wear the shapeless, lifeless gray garment my mother had laid out for me. Instead, I arrived wearing a tailored, dark sapphire blue dress. It was structural, sharp, and possessed an undeniable edge of modern armor. The color contrasted starkly against the sea of pastel silks and muted floral patterns worn by the rest of the female guests. When I walked through the towering double doors of the grand reception hall, I caught my mother's eye from across the room. Elise's perfectly painted smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Her eyes narrowed into tight, furious slits. She would have preferred a screaming match in the foyer over this quiet, absolute defiance. My calm demeanor infuriated her precisely because she could not control it. A young host in a crisp tuxedo directed me to my assigned seat. I found my silver-plated name card at table 19. It was positioned exactly where I expected it to be. I was seated in the far back corner of the massive room, directly adjacent to the swinging wooden doors of the catering kitchen. The air here smelled of roasted tenderloin, industrial dishwashers, and the nervous sweat of the waitstaff. It was a brilliantly calculated placement. I was just visible enough to be captured in the wide-angle photographs of the sweeping room, proving to the groom's family that the Underwoods were perfectly united. Yet, I was placed far enough away from the epicenter of power that no one of any social consequence would accidentally engage me in conversation and ask uncomfortable questions. From my shadowy vantage point, I watched my father operate. Graham Underwood worked the expansive room like a veteran politician in the final days of a tight campaign. He held a crystal glass of expensive bourbon in his left hand, leaving his right hand free to grip shoulders, shake hands, and direct the flow of attention. He laughed loudly, a booming practice sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. As he introduced my sister to the various visiting dignitaries and wealthy investors, his voice carried effortlessly over the soft classical music playing from the string quartet. "This is the child who makes our family so incredibly proud," Graham declared, beaming at Delaney. He repeated the exact phrase at 3 different tables. He placed a heavy, deliberate emphasis on the word "the," ensuring everyone within earshot understood the unspoken addendum. Delaney was the child who made them proud, which meant the other daughter sitting in the corner near the kitchen doors was the one who did not. I shifted my focus away from my father and began a quiet, clinical assessment of the Mercer family seated at the grand head table. Nolan Mercer, the groom, looked at my sister with an expression of profound, unfiltered adoration. He held her hand gently on the linen tablecloth, leaning in to catch her whispers. He genuinely loved her. He believed he was marrying into a legacy of grace and philanthropy. Recognizing his genuine affection made the impending destruction feel suddenly heavy. He was collateral damage in a war he did not even know was being fought. Next to Nolan sat his mother, Cynthia Mercer. She was the architect of the multi-million-dollar grant currently sitting in escrow, and the woman who had spent the last 3 months corresponding with me under my professional alias. Cynthia was a formidable presence. While the local Briar Glen socialites gossiped and drank heavily, Cynthia sat completely composed. She wore a simple, elegant black gown and drank sparkling water. Her sharp eyes tracked the movements of the room with the precise, calculating gaze of a woman who managed vast fortunes. She was not easily swayed by the expensive floral cascades or my father's booming charisma. She was looking for structural integrity, and tonight, she was about to witness a total collapse. When the dinner plates were cleared by the silent, moving army of servers, the speeches began. The best man offered a predictable, mildly embarrassing story about college. Then, Delaney stood up, taking the wireless microphone with a radiant, flawless smile. She launched into a carefully scripted narrative of her childhood in Briar Glen. She painted a picture of a golden, sun-drenched upbringing filled with unconditional love and unwavering support. But as I listened to her weave her pristine history, I realized what she was doing. She was systematically erasing my existence. She recounted building a treehouse in the backyard, omitting the fact that I was the one who drew the blueprints and bought the wood. She talked about her grandfather's love for the charity fund, never once mentioning that I was the one he trusted to manage it. To the 200 guests listening in rapt attention, Delaney was an only child who had occasionally been burdened by a dark shadow. Toward the end of her speech, her sweet tone shifted, taking on a sudden, sharp edge. We all know that life is not perfect, Delaney said, her eyes scanning the crowd with practiced vulnerability. Every family has its challenges. We all know one person who simply refuses to be happy for others, someone who tries to pull you into their own darkness. She did not say my name. She did not have to. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the room, and dozens of heads turned slightly, eyes cutting through the dim lighting to look directly at table 19. I took a slow sip of my water, my expression remaining completely blank, giving them absolutely nothing to consume. The clinking of crystal glasses signaled a brief intermission before the dancing commenced. Elise detached herself from a group of wealthy donors and glided across the room toward my table. She moved with the fluid grace of a dancer, her smile firmly fixed in place for the benefit of any onlookers. When she reached my side, she leaned down, her delicate hands reaching out to straighten my water goblet and adjust my linen napkin. It looked like the tender, attentive gesture of a loving mother. Then, her mouth moved close to my ear, and her voice dropped to a temperature that could freeze blood. "Do not embarrass us tonight," Elise hissed, her words clipping against each other like stones. "You sit right here. You keep your mouth shut. You are going to sign the release paperwork in the morning, and then you are going to go back to whatever pathetic life you built. Do you understand me?" She patted my shoulder firmly and turned away before I could respond. Her venomous little visit was the final confirmation I needed. Nora had been entirely correct. There was no olive branch. There was no hope for reconciliation. They had brought me here purely to use my physical presence as a prop, and they planned to discard me the moment the Mercer grant cleared the bank. Suddenly, the massive crystal chandeliers above us dimmed, plunging the perimeter of the room into heavy shadows. The soft ambient lighting shifted to focus entirely on the main stage, where a massive white projection screen silently descended from the vaulted ceiling. The master of ceremonies, his voice booming through the surround sound speakers, announced that the parents of the bride had prepared a very special, intimate presentation for the couple. I did not look at the screen. I looked up toward the elevated, glass-enclosed technical booth at the back of the hall. Through the tinted glass, illuminated by the cold blue glow of multiple digital monitors, I saw Mara Keene. She was standing behind the primary mixing board, wearing a black headset. For one brief, terrifying second, her eyes met mine across the dark, crowded expanse of the venue. She gave me a single, sharp nod. The override protocols were active. The evidence packets were locked and loaded. Every single digital exit route had been secured. Beneath the heavy linen tablecloth, hidden entirely from the world, my right hand rested on my lap. My phone screen was illuminated, set to maximum brightness. The secure messaging application was open to my encrypted thread with Mara. My thumb hovered exactly half an inch above the send button. The word release was already typed into the text box, waiting in absolute silence. I stared at the dark silhouettes of my family gathering near the front of the stage, ready to deliver their final, fatal blow to my character. My pulse beat a slow, steady rhythm in my throat. I sat perfectly still in the dark, my heart waiting to see exactly how ruthless a family could be when they fully believed their victim had no teeth left to bite back. The massive projection screen illuminated the darkened reception hall with a warm, golden glow. A soft, sweeping orchestral melody filled the room, perfectly synchronized with a montage of carefully curated photographs. There were images of my parents standing on the manicured lawns of the country club, my grandfather cutting ribbons at the local library, and Delaney in various stages of a sun-drenched, flawless childhood. It was a masterful piece of visual propaganda, designed to reinforce the myth of the Underwood family as the absolute pinnacle of Southern philanthropic grace. The music faded to a low, instrumental hum as my father stepped into the center spotlight. He held the wireless microphone with the relaxed, confident grip of a man who owned the room and everyone in it. "Every family has a history," Graham began, his voice rich and resonating through the surround sound speakers. "We all have our triumphs, our moments of profound pride, and of course, our cautionary tales. The Underwood family has Phoebe, A low ripple of laughter moved through the sea of seated guests. It was the kind of polite, slightly uncomfortable chuckle people offer when they assume a patriarch is engaging in a bit of edgy, self-deprecating wedding humor. They thought it was a playful jab at an estranged relative. They did not understand they were witnessing an execution. The slide on the massive screen transitioned. The golden, nostalgic hue vanished, replaced by a stark, aggressive font against a dark background. The words plastered across the screen read, "The Family Disgrace." Beneath that bold heading, several phrases faded into view, appearing one by one like bullet holes in the silence. Liar, saboteur, the daughter who stained the family name, put her hands on the scholarship money. The polite laughter in the room abruptly died. The guests shifted in their velvet-cushioned chairs, exchanging bewildered, uneasy glances. This was no longer a joke. This was a public branding. Delaney stepped up to stand beside our father. Her pristine white gown practically glowed under the stage lights. She took the microphone from him, offering the crowd a sad, incredibly brave smile that she must have practiced in the mirror for weeks. "We wanted to be honest tonight," Delaney said, her voice trembling with just the right amount of manufactured sorrow, because building a new life with Nolan means leaving the darkness of the past behind. Every family has that one person who simply refuses to heal. Someone who always turns other people's happy days into a story about themselves. We are choosing to step out of that shadow today. Beneath the table, my thumb remained suspended over the glowing glass of my phone screen. My heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I was a professional investigator. I dismantled corporate empires for a living. I did not act on impulse. I gave them one final, agonizing half-beat to stop. I waited for someone, anyone in my family, to realize they had gone too far, to pull back from the edge of absolute cruelty. Instead, my mother stood up from her seat at the head table. Elise raised her crystal glass of champagne high into the air. She did not look at the crowd. She turned her head, her gaze piercing through the dim lighting, locking directly onto me in my shadowy corner by the kitchen doors. "Well," Elise announced, her voice carrying clearly without the aid of a microphone, "at least tonight she knows how to sit still." That was it, the final, undeniable confirmation that they were entirely devoid of redemption. They did not just want me out of the picture, they wanted to display my mounted head on their pristine social wall. I did not cry. I did not storm out of the hall. I lowered my gaze to the bright screen resting on my lap, and I tapped my thumb exactly once. Release. I sent the word out into the digital ether. I placed the phone face down on the linen tablecloth, picked up my water goblet, and took a slow, deliberate sip. For exactly 2 seconds, the reception hall plunged into total, suffocating darkness. The music cut out with a sharp, electronic snap. A collective gasp echoed from the 200 guests. In the elevated technical booth, Mara Keene had executed the override sequence with flawless precision. When the massive screen flickered back to life, the golden hue and the Underwood family photos were gone. The stage was bathed in the harsh, clinical light of a completely different presentation. There was no music. There was no decorative border. It was a stark, black and white slide featuring a single sentence in massive, unyielding text. "Before you call someone a disgrace, ask who actually emptied the scholarship fund." The entire room turned to stone. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. The silence was so profound I could hear the faint hum of the industrial refrigerators in the kitchen behind me. 3 seconds later, the slide advanced automatically. The screen filled with the undeniable digitized scans of the trust bank statements Nora and I had compiled. The evidence was presented with brutal clarity. Red arrows connected the outflow columns of the charity accounts directly to the inflow ledgers of the wedding vendors. The first transaction showed a wire transfer of $65,000, moving from the student grant account into the operating budget of the luxury wedding planner standing in the back of the room. The second transaction displayed $40,000 rerouted through a fake community repair invoice directly into the event production company that provided the floral arrangements resting on every single table. Then, the final, devastating piece of evidence appeared. A clear magnified shot of a signed authorization draft for $200,000, labeled as a housing stipend initiative, depositing directly into a limited liability corporation. Below the transaction, the state business registry document was displayed, clearly highlighting the sole proprietor of that corporation, Delaney Underwood. In the bottom right corner of the screen, a small, blinking digital timestamp glowed bright red, followed by a simple line of text. Evidence packet delivered. The delayed shockwave finally hit the room. Graham dropped his microphone. It hit the hardwood stage with a deafening, high-pitched screech of audio feedback that made several guests cover their ears. He lunged off the stage, his face purple with rage, sprinting wildly toward the glass-enclosed technical booth at the back of the hall. Delaney stood frozen in her thousands of dollars of stolen white silk. Her practiced smile was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of absolute paralyzing horror as she stared at her own name projected in 20-foot letters next to a felony bank transfer. Elise sank slowly back into her chair, the crystal champagne flute slipping from her manicured fingers and shattering against the floor, spilling expensive wine across her shoes. But the most important reaction came from the center of the head table. Cynthia Mercer had her phone in her hand. The screen was illuminated. I knew exactly what she was looking at. Mara's automated relay had worked flawlessly. The secure data packet had bypassed all local networks and landed directly in Cynthia's private inbox. Cynthia stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. She stared at her phone, her eyes scanning the sender information attached to the heavily encrypted dossier. She read the name of the sender out loud, her voice cutting through the rising murmur of the panicked crowd like a serrated blade. Phoebe Underwood, Blackwater Advisory Group. Cynthia looked up from her screen, her sharp eyes scanning the room until they found me sitting quietly in the back corner. In that singular moment, she understood everything. She realized that the anonymous, ruthless senior director she had hired to audit her future in-laws was the exact same woman those in-laws were currently trying to publicly execute. The string quartet was packing their instruments. Guests were whispering frantically, their phones out, snapping photos of the massive screen before anyone could cut the power. The polite upper-class veneer of the Briar Glen elite fractured and shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. Alder Hall was no longer the site of a majestic wedding. It had been instantly transformed into a brightly lit crime scene, and 200 of the wealthiest people in the state had just realized they were eating dinner inside a massive, undeniable fraud. The immediate shockwave paralyzed the room for exactly 10 seconds before my father's survival instincts overrode his shock. Graham sprinted back to the center of the hardwood stage, his face a mask of furious, desperate authority. He pointed a trembling finger toward the elevated technical booth at the back of the hall. "Turn that garbage off right now," he bellowed, his voice cracking without the aid of the microphone. He turned back to the crowd, his hands raised in a frantic, placating gesture. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. This is a malicious fabrication. My eldest daughter has a long, documented history of severe mental instability. She forged these documents out of pure, unadulterated jealousy because she simply cannot stand to see her sister happy today." But the Briar Glen elite were no longer looking at him. They were looking down at their laps. A chorus of soft, synchronized chimes and vibrations rippled through the reception hall. Guests who had managed to snap photos of the massive projection screen were already sharing the images, sending the undeniable proof to the other tables. The mathematical anatomy of his embezzlement was spreading from phone to phone faster than his practiced lies could ever contain it. Sensing her father rapidly losing his iron grip on the narrative, Delaney immediately pivoted to the only strategy she had left. She collapsed into her chair at the head table, buried her face in her hands, and began to weep hysterically. "How could you do this to me today?" Delaney wailed, her voice echoing in the cavernous space, perfectly calibrated to sound like a broken-hearted victim. "Why do you hate us so much? You ruined my wedding." It was a masterful, instinctual performance. For a few fleeting seconds, the psychological gravity of the room actually began to shift back toward the weeping bride in the pristine white gown. The older guests exchanged sympathetic glances, fully primed by years of gossip to believe the familiar narrative of the deranged, vindictive sister ruining a fairy tale. That fragile illusion shattered into dust the moment Cynthia Mercer stepped forward. She did not yell. She did not raise her voice to compete with Graham. She simply cut through the manufactured melodrama with the cold, absolute precision of a seasoned corporate executive. "Delaney," Cynthia said, her tone entirely devoid of any maternal warmth. "If this is a fabrication, why did the scholarship fund pay for the stage you are currently crying on?" The question hung in the air, heavy and completely unanswerable. Delaney's sobs hitched abruptly in her throat. She looked up, her mascara perfectly intact, searching for her groom to defend her, but Nolan Mercer was no longer standing by her side. For the first time all evening, he had physically taken a step away from his bride. He stared at Delaney with a look of profound, quiet devastation. He had not stopped loving her in that exact instant, but he was looking at a complete stranger. He suddenly realized that the woman he was about to marry might have built her entire existence on a foundation of stories meticulously scrubbed clean by other people's money. While the head table dissolved into a silent, agonizing standoff, I felt a shadow fall across my table. My mother had navigated the chaos and slipped into the empty chair beside me. Elise grabbed my wrist, her grip surprisingly vicious, her eyes wide with a perfectly calibrated mix of maternal pain and sheer panic. "Phoebe, darling, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Do not make things worse than they already are. Let us go to the private bridal suite right now. We can contain this. We just need you to sign a quick clarification statement for the guests, just to calm everyone down, and we will make sure you are taken care of." Even as their entire empire burned to the ground around them, my mother still firmly believed she could manage me. She still thought I was just a petulant child throwing a tantrum that could be silenced with a piece of paper in a private room. I gently but firmly pried her fingers off my wrist. I did not engage in a screaming match. I did not hurl bitter insults. I simply spoke clearly, projecting my voice just enough so the wealthy donors at the adjacent tables could hear every single syllable. "I did not come here to tell a new story," I said, holding her gaze. "I came to stop the old one from continuing to swallow the students' money." Before Elise could counter, a tall man in a dark suit approached our table. It was Cynthia Mercer's personal security detail. "Miss Underwood," he said, ignoring my mother entirely. "Mrs. Mercer requests a brief meeting with you in the venue's library." Now, I stood up, smoothed the skirt of my dark sapphire dress, and walked away from my mother without a single backward glance. The small, oak-paneled library adjacent to the main coat check was soundproofed and mercifully quiet. Cynthia stood by the unlit fireplace, her posture rigid. I did not walk in seeking validation. I did not offer a tearful apology for ruining the evening. I opened my clutch and retrieved a sealed, heavy-duty encrypted flash drive containing the raw data files, alongside a manila folder holding the physical, certified copies of the bank routing ledgers. "Here is the physical chain of custody," I stated, handing the materials to her with the clinical detachment of a senior director closing an audit. "The digital copies are already in your legal counsel's inbox. The timestamps verify the backdated board resolutions, and the routing numbers directly link the charity accounts to tonight's vendors." Cynthia took the folder, her sharp eyes scanning my face. She recognized the absolute lack of emotion. I was not a wounded daughter looking for justice. I was a forensic expert handing over an active crime scene. As I walked back out into the main corridor, my phone buzzed in my hand. It was a secure text from Mara Keene. "Server lockdown confirmed. Graham just tried to remotely wipe the estate's internal accounting drives. He hit my firewall. The deletion orders are logged and date-stamped. He is trapped." My single, one-word text message had slammed the heavy iron doors shut on their familiar escape routes. When I returned to the main hall, The fairy tale was officially dead. The aftermath was a sprawling, unpatchable disaster. Nearly 50% of the guests had already fled toward the valet stand, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of a massive financial scandal. The Mercer family had completely physically separated from the Underwoods, gathering their belongings in a tight, silent group near the main exit. Delaney sat completely alone at the massive head table, a solitary figure drowning in white silk, staring blankly at a phone screen that was no longer receiving comforting messages from her groom. Across the room, Graham stood amidst the wreckage of his shattered reputation. He looked at the empty chairs, the spilled champagne, and the whispers echoing off the marble walls. Then, his eyes found me standing by the kitchen doors. For the very first time in my 34 years of life, my father did not look at me with boredom or disguised contempt. He looked at me with genuine, unadulterated fear. He finally understood that I had not just returned to Briar Glen carrying 15 years of unresolved trauma. I had returned wielding the precise, surgical capacity to completely destroy his entire machine of lies. But as I turned my back on the ruined reception and walked out into the cool, humid South Carolina night, I felt no overwhelming sense of victory. I knew the rules of the world they operated in. Men like Graham Underwood did not just surrender because they lost the narrative at a fancy dinner party. Tomorrow morning, the initial shock would wear off, and the ruthless counterattack would begin. They would weaponize their remaining capital. They would hire the most aggressive defense attorneys in the state. They would leverage every political connection they had cultivated over 3 decades, and they would immediately begin spinning a new, highly funded version of the obsessed, vindictive daughter myth that this town had swallowed so effortlessly 15 years ago. The first bomb had detonated flawlessly, but the war for the truth was only just beginning. The sun rose over Briar Glen the morning after the reception, but the suffocating darkness of the scandal only tightened its grip on the town. My father did not spend the early hours reflecting on his moral failures. Graham Underwood spent them orchestrating a scorched earth campaign to save his rapidly disintegrating reputation. By 7 o'clock in the morning, he had deployed a mass email to every single member of the trust board and all major community donors. He completely bypassed the undeniable banking evidence and attacked the messenger. He claimed that I had maliciously hacked into the outdated, vulnerable archives of the foundation, fabricated the transaction records, and staged a highly sophisticated cyber attack. He repeatedly leaned on the phrase, history of severe instability, frantically trying to shove the entire catastrophe back into the familiar, comfortable box of the 15-year-old smear campaign he had originally used to exile me. While Graham managed the corporate narrative, my mother managed the social fallout. Elise sat in her sunroom, a cup of untouched herbal tea growing cold beside her, and personally called every influential woman in her elite charity circles. She weaponized her maternal grief with terrifying precision. She wept softly into the receiver, telling her friends that I had always harbored a sick, obsessive jealousy toward my younger sister. She claimed I had patiently waited for the absolute most important day of Delaney's life to enact my bitter revenge. Elise proved in those phone calls that she was never more dangerous than when she was wearing the soft, delicate mask of a wounded mother. At 10 o'clock in the morning, their aggressive counteroffensive arrived directly at my hotel room door in the form of a legal courier. The man handed me a thick, heavy stock envelope sealed with the crest of my father's corporate defense attorneys. Inside was a formal cease and desist order, threatening me with catastrophic civil litigation for defamation and data theft. But the true centerpiece of the package was a photocopy of a formal letter of voluntary resignation, supposedly surrendering all my oversight rights to the scholarship fund. The document was dated exactly 5 years ago. I stood by the hotel window, holding the paper up to the natural light, and I actually laughed. It was an act of profound, staggering desperation. They had digitally spliced my signature from an old, scanned college application and pasted it onto the bottom of the legal document. I could see the faint pixelation around the ink loops, the subtle shift in the background contrast. My parents were so deeply entrenched in their own arrogance that they actually thought they could pass off a forged signature to a senior director of forensic review. By submitting that document, they had officially crossed the line from social maneuvering into a fully prosecutable, heavily documented federal crime. Meanwhile, a much quieter, far more devastating collapse was occurring inside the walls of the Underwood estate. Delaney had spent the night locked in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by the discarded, chaotic remnants of her shattered fairy tale. Early in the afternoon, she ventured downstairs into her mother's private sitting room, desperately searching for the leather binder containing the vendor contracts, hoping to find some administrative error she could use to blindly defend her parents. Instead, hidden beneath a stack of unpaid floral invoices, she discovered a different file folder. It was the finalized purchase agreement for the luxury apartment in Charleston. Delaney opened it, her eyes scanning the dense legal text until she reached the payment schedule. There, printed in stark black ink, was the exact routing number of the corporate shell company our mother controlled, funneling an advance from the Underwood Scholars Trust directly into the property deed. In that singular, suffocating moment, Delaney experienced a violent paradigm shift. For her entire life, she had believed she was the golden child, the beloved daughter who earned her parents' endless affection by being compliant, sweet, and perfectly presented. Looking at the stolen money funding her new home, she finally realized the horrifying truth. She was not the most loved child. She was simply the most effectively displayed child. She was nothing more than a beautiful, flawless social ornament they used to distract the public while they looted the vault. They had not just sacrificed my future to hide their greed. They had actively turned Delaney's sacred wedding day into a functional money laundering operation. The illusion of her perfect romance evaporated an hour later when Nolan Mercer called her private line. Nolan did not yell, and he did not insult her, which somehow made the conversation infinitely worse. His voice was hollow, stripped of all the warm adoration he had shown her just 24 hours prior. He informed Delaney that he loved the woman he thought she was, but he absolutely would not sign the legal marriage registry. The lavish ceremony they had performed the night before was now nothing but expensive theater. He explicitly stated that there would be no legal union until a forensic audit cleared her name of any complicity. Simultaneously, Cynthia Mercer formally notified Graham that the Mercer Civic Trust was indefinitely freezing the multi-million-dollar grant and suspending all partnership commitments. The crisis instantly mutated from a humiliating society scandal into a catastrophic financial hemorrhage that threatened to bankrupt the Underwood legacy. Back at the hotel, Mara and I were not resting. We were digging deeper into the raw server data Nora had liberated. What we found beneath the surface of the wedding expenses was a layer of systemic, calculated cruelty that made my blood run entirely cold. We discovered that over the past 3 years, dozens of highly qualified high school seniors had their scholarship renewals abruptly canceled. The official letters claimed the trust was experiencing a temporary lack of liquidity due to market fluctuations, but the ledgers told the real story. The money meant for their tuition had been systematically diverted into accounts labeled as special management fees. Those fees were then quietly routed through various event production companies, high-end public relations firms, and ultimately, directly into my parents' personal family spending accounts. They had stolen the future of working-class teenagers to pay for their country club dues and imported wine. Just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Nora Beckett arrived at my hotel room. The constant, nervous tremor that had plagued her for years was entirely gone. She walked in standing perfectly straight, holding a small, worn leather notebook. It was my grandfather's personal diary. Nora turned to a page dated nearly 2 decades ago and pointed to a passage written in Elias Underwood's unmistakable, sprawling handwriting. The ink was faded, but the mandate was absolute. My grandfather had written that the sole purpose of the fund was to ensure that no one in this town has to trade their education for their silence. Nora looked at me, her eyes fiercely clear. She announced that she was no longer hiding in the shadows. She was going to stand beside me and testify to the board. Everything converged on a mandatory, emergency session of the trust board and the primary donors. scheduled for 3 o'clock at the Briar Glen Civic House. Graham orchestrated the meeting, fully believing he still held the ultimate upper hand. He assumed he could walk into that room, deploy his booming charisma, utilize Elise's perfectly timed tears, and rely on Delaney to sit silently behind him, acting as the ultimate shield of injured innocence. He thought the sheer weight of his historical authority would crush my digital evidence, but as my father prepared his legal team and adjusted his expensive silk tie, he was entirely blind to the fatal flaw in his final strategy. He did not know that the undeniable proof of his embezzlement had already been verified by a forensic team. He did not know that Nora was arriving with the founding documents. And most dangerously of all, he did not know that for the first time in her life, Delaney Underwood was completely breaking character, finally stepping out of the script he had written for her. The Briar Glen Civic House was a monumental stone building designed to project absolute civic authority. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the main assembly room felt less like a boardroom and more like a tribunal. The heavy oak tables were arranged in a wide horseshoe. Seated around them were the remaining members of the trust board, the primary corporate donors, 3 independent legal representatives, and most damningly, a small cluster of local parents whose children had mysteriously lost their educational funding over the last 36 months. This was no longer a scandalous society rumor. This was a forensic dissection of stolen futures. I did not walk through the double doors as a wounded daughter seeking an emotional apology. I walked in as a senior director of forensic review. I wore a tailored black suit and carried a single, heavily encrypted tablet. I bypassed the empty chair left near my parents and walked directly to the presentation podium at the front of the room. I connected my device to the central monitor and immediately transformed a decade and a half of familial manipulation into cold, inescapable mathematics. For the next 45 minutes, I presented the exact chronological flow of the stolen capital. I did not raise my voice or hurl bitter accusations. I let the raw data do the screaming. I projected the primary ledgers onto the screen, tracing how my parents had utilized the scholarship fund as a personal, flexible credit line. I showed the board the exact dates when educational grants were canceled, juxtaposed directly against matching withdrawal amounts used to pay off high-limit luxury credit cards. I tracked the capital flowing into public relations firms to maintain their flawless social image, and I mapped the phantom invoices routed through friendly local businesses. Finally, I displayed the massive financial pipeline that had funded the aborted wedding, explicitly highlighting how imported floral arrangements and custom stage lighting were categorized as community outreach initiatives. My father sat rigid at the defense table, his jaw clenched tight. Graham attempted to interrupt twice, citing administrative errors and demanding that the board dismiss my presentation as a vindictive, unauthorized hack. I silenced him by projecting the digital metadata reports Mara Keene had extracted. I showed the room the exact hour and minute the fraudulent board minutes were created, proving they were authored weeks after the supposed meetings took place and systematically backdated. I followed that with the certified forensic analysis of my supposed voluntary resignation letter. I explained, in clinical detail, how my signature had been digitally lifted from a 10-year-old college application and grafted onto the bottom of a fabricated legal document. The intricate, towering fortress of lies my father had spent 15 years building completely disintegrated in under 1 hour. Backed into a corner with absolutely no viable exits, Graham deployed his final, most desperate strategy. He stood up, placing both hands flat on the mahogany table, and attempted to pivot the felony into a heartbreaking family tragedy. "We were simply trying to protect the reputation of the fund from a highly unstable situation," Graham pleaded, looking directly at the parents of the defrauded students. "My daughter has always been deeply troubled. We made irregular administrative choices, yes, but only to shield this community from her destructive behavior. Everything we did was for the ultimate survival of the trust." He expected his youngest daughter to play her part. He expected her to sit silently behind him, projecting an aura of traumatized innocence to anchor his emotional manipulation. Instead, Delaney stood up. She was no longer wearing the white silk gown, but a simple, dark sweater. She looked exhausted, hollowed out, and entirely finished with the script. She looked directly at our father, then turned to face the entire room. "That is a lie," Delaney stated, her voice shaking but completely clear. "My parents knew exactly where the money was coming from. I found the property contracts this morning. They used the scholarship money to pay for my reception, and they used it to buy my new apartment. I did not know the full extent of the theft from the beginning, but I saw enough of the invoices over the last 6 months, and I chose to stay completely silent." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery of parents. Graham staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. The ultimate betrayal had not come from the daughter he threw away. It came from the golden child he had explicitly trained to survive at any cost. By confessing her own complicity, Delaney drove the final nail into the coffin of their public image. There was no saving the Underwood legacy now. Cynthia Mercer stood up from her seat at the donor table. She did not look at my parents with anger. She looked at them with absolute, freezing disgust. "The Mercer Civic Trust is formally withdrawing all proposed funding," Cynthia announced, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "Furthermore, my legal team will finance a complete, independent restructuring of this organization, but only under one absolute condition. Graham and Elise Underwood must resign from every single administrative, executive, and honorary position associated with this foundation, effective immediately." The board members did not even debate the motion. They voted unanimously to approve the terms right there in the heavy, suffocating air of the assembly room. The scholarship accounts were instantly frozen pending a massive federal audit. My father was formally stripped of his presidency. My mother sat frozen in her chair, realizing she had just lost every single social seat, charity chairmanship, and country club privilege she had spent her entire life clinging to. As for Delaney, the grand fairy tale wedding was officially canceled, leaving her entirely isolated in a town that would soon treat her with the exact same toxic whispers they had once reserved for me. The room slowly began to empty. The board members actively avoided making eye contact with my parents as they filed out the double doors. I stood at the podium, packing my tablet into my leather briefcase. Graham finally looked at me across the empty expanse of the horseshoe table. He looked small, defeated, and incredibly old. I did not smile in triumph. I did not scream at them for the 15 years of stolen time, and I did not demand that they fall to their knees and beg for my forgiveness. I simply zipped my briefcase shut and looked them dead in the eye. "My name will be officially cleared in writing," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "Every single dollar you stole from those children will be repaid, even if you have to liquidate the estate to do it. And from this day forward, not a single one of you will ever use my story to protect your own power again." I turned my back on them and walked down the center aisle. I stepped out of the Briar Glen Civic House and into the warm, fading light of the late afternoon. The heavy southern humidity felt different now. It no longer felt suffocating. It felt clear. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen was completely silent. There were no frantic text messages, no threats, no manipulative voicemails. The ghost that had haunted me for 15 years was finally dead. A single text message had triggered the digital avalanche. That one word had preserved the evidence, shattered the flawless family facade, blocked their desperate attempts to wipe the servers, and forced an entire town to finally look at the ugly, undeniable truth. I walked toward my rental car, the gravel crunching softly beneath my shoes. I was leaving this town forever, but this time, I was not running away in disgrace. From the night they branded me the family disgrace, I never became a person waiting to be forgiven. I became a woman who simply no longer needed their permission to exist. Thank you all so much for listening to this story today. Where are you listening to this video from? Please leave a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts together. Do not forget to subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support us by hitting that hype button so that this story can be heard by many more people.